hi again, folks, and welcome into UnAnchored Boston with Bob Lobel. I'm Mike Lynch, and as always, we are brought to you by Cold Springs RV, your destination for all things camping. And where? We're in New Hampshire, of course, and by the great George Gray, the big wheel we call him at George Gray's Lexington Toyota, 409 Mass Ave in Lexington. All right, we've got a fascinating guest today who's worn just about every hat there is to be worn in the city of Boston, and probably is not done wearing hats in the city of Boston, Mr. Larry Moulter. And as always, the official introduction is always handled by Robert Lobel. So, Lobie, take it away.
All right, Lynchy. We're very happy to have Larry Moulter here today. Now, listen, I think, I guess a normal sports show would be talking about Belichick,
Right.
North Carolina.
Yeah.
We'll be talking about the start of the National Football League season, which is tomorrow night, or any 4 games, or any of the college football things. I think Belichick would have been the story, would have been Kraft and his son's reaction, and all this stuff that went on. But we're breaking the mold and going to Larry Moulter and still talk about all those things. Larry ran the Boston Garden in the 70s and 80s. He was president of the Boston Garden. He followed the great Paul Mooney, and I'm saying that with a tongue-in-cheek because Paul Mooney was not so great, at least a lot of people that. Anyway, how did Paul Mooney get that job?
Well, I think when the Jacobs family bought the Bruins and the building and the concession company in the mid-'70s, he was with the family for a long time in the pari-mutuel industry. And I think they thought, given that he was local, he would be an appropriate fit to run the garden.
You were involved in the old garden becoming the new garden too. I mean, this was a big deal.
Well, and my kids still hold it against me that I'm the one who shut the old garden. But I think now, 30 years after that closure, we can all stand up very proudly and say that we have one of the best arenas in the nation.
I just want to show you this picture. Go ahead. Keep talking.
Well, that's the old garden, right? Oh, yeah.
It's one of my favorite pictures of all time.
Well, I'll tell you my favorite story. When that was being torn down, my older boy in April of that particular year was going to a Red Sox game with a friend. And he said, I want to go see the garden that you're tearing down. He had come home from school. And so we drove down the old Accolon Way. And I said, I'll let you get out and pay your respects to the building. I drove down to the end, turned around, and as I was coming back towards Causeway Street, he was running with his friend with several bricks in his hand into the back of my car, at which point a Boston police officer came over to him and said, listen, you have a choice. You can put those bricks back down or I'm going to arrest you. And my son said, but Dad, these are the people's bricks. And I said, Alex, you have to understand one thing. If you get arrested, the story will not be you. It will be former garden president and CEO stealing bricks from the destruction of the garden. Fortunately, he put them down, and I was able at some later date to get him bricks.
Everybody's got a souvenir from there. I bought 3 stadium seats, the yellow, and they're in my basement with all my other paraphernalia. And I know all that stuff went to charity. All the proceeds from many of those things. If you don't have something from the garden, you're nobody in this town.
Well, I have a couple of nice mementos from the garden. One of them being my wife and I, 50 years ago this January, had our first date ever at the Boston Garden for a Celtics-Laker game. And it was up in section 104. And she paid for her own ticket. I paid for mine. But when I left in 96, the summer of 96, they gave us 2 chairs from section 104. I don't remember the exact row, and I'll say this very quietly because I don't want her to hear it.
I'll tell Pam. I'll call Pam and I'll tell her.
Well, she'll probably watch this and she'll find out anyway. But the anniversary of that date was January 7th, and the Celtics are playing at the TD Garden that particular day. So maybe she'll go back.
Wow.
After 50 years.
Well, we're going to circle back and find out how things went. If the marriage is still blooming, as they say.
Well, we're married about 49 years. A couple of them were good, as I said.
I've been married about 49 years, just not to the same person.
Well, we all walk our own roads.
Yes, yeah.
Before we get too far removed from Paul Mooney, I can just remember when Bobby Carpenter was coming out of St. John's Prep.
Right.
And the guys were sitting around the conference table and said, I think we ought to get that Carpenter guy from up in the North Shore. And legend has it that Mooney says, we got too many goddamn carpenters already in this building. We don't need another carpenter. You thought they were talking about another laborer, right?
Yeah, the labor. We had a very aggressive carpenters union there. And actually, on the first day that I was appointed, I pulled up the ramp to the 150 Causeway Street, which the second floor was the parking area and the marshalling area for the old garden. You might remember the old garden was connected to the 150 Causeway Street by two bridges.
Yeah.
And the Zamboni went across there, and the elephant stayed on the second floor. The parquet was there and all. And I remember literally getting out of my car that very, very first morning, and a fellow in overalls walks up to me and goes, "You're the new guy?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." He goes, "Too bad you've already lost." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "You've already effing lost." And I said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm the business agent for the carpenters." And he walks next to me and he said, "Do you know why you lost? Because you'll never take a strike in this building and you'll never beat us." And he picked up his pace and walked away.
Wow.
This.
Welcome to the garden.
Yeah, very first day.
Wow.
You brought up the elephants, and this is what I want to tell you. You were the guy that brought. I mean, there's so many other things I wanted to talk about, but now that we're going down this road, you were the guy that brought bands into the garden. They never had bands and acts. I've seen two. I saw the Grateful Dead and Elton John.
Well, we had the Grateful Dead 3 years, and we were supposed to have the Grateful Dead in August of '95 or September of '95, depending on the scheduling, as we closed out the garden. You might remember that we closed the garden with a month-long extravaganza of different things, including the formal closure, which was broadcast on CBS and Dan Rather on September 29th, where the Kodak moment, we had a stage in the center of the old garden, but the Kodak moment was Bobby Orr and Larry Bird walking around the center of the stage, holding their arms up high. So, there were a lot of moments there. There were a lot of things that were happening that we celebrated, but the Dead were supposed to come back. And unfortunately, Jerry Garcia died in early of August of '95. But we would have them for 6 shows each year, 3 nights on, 1 night off, 3 nights on. And again, we had hoped to use them to close the garden, but Jerry decided to cash it in.
So, can't imagine. In terms of these acts and the bands, who is your favorite, the easiest one, maybe the hardest one to deal with? What, I'm sure there are a lot of behind the scenes stories before we even get to the circus. Who are the things, the guys that you really wanted to work with and did not, and then ones that you didn't?
I think part of the reason I was brought to the garden was severalfold, to sort of upgrade the advertising system there. There were no dashboard advertisements during the Paul Mooney era, and they were beginning to emerge as a significant source of revenue. So I was brought in by the then chairman of the board, Bill Hassett, who had been a longtime friend of Jerry Jacobs from Buffalo, who was a developer in his own right. He was at that time the chair of the New York State Dormitory Authority, and he had built Battery Park in New York City. And he was the one that convinced Jerry Jacobs in, I think it was 84, 85. There was a ne'er-do-well developer by the name of Brennan who tried to buy the garden and the room for $35 million. And Bill Hassett, having been a longtime friend of the Jacobs family and Jerry Jacobs in particular, said, "You're missing something here. This is not about retaining concessions in the building. This is about a real estate deal." So consequently, he never sold it. Brennan went off to Chicago and I think was indicted on mortgage fraud there. But, so I was brought in to build out an advertising system, computerize the box office, because even though Ticketmaster and Ticketron were beginning to emerge, Paul Mooney had really strong negative feelings about computers, and particularly a computer.
I do too.
Yeah. Well, we're on one, so it must be.
No, right.
And I was brought in to bring back concerts. At that time, the Worcester Centrum was doing a lot of music. And I remember in May of '87, U2 had come into town and was playing at the Worcester Centrum. And I said to Don Law, the promoter, I need U2 to come and play the building. He said, they'll never play the building because its sound is awful. You have too many unions, too many ghosts you're paying there. And I said, well, I want to meet the manager. So he gave me the connection of the manager who was staying at the Four Seasons, who became a dear friend. In fact, we talked 2 days ago, Paul McGinnis, who sold his business about 12 years ago. And I went over and had lunch with him. And I said, we really should get U2 to play the building. That was my band. That was the band that was going to put us back on the map. And he said, well, you've got all these problems. And I said, listen, we have a Celtics playoff game tomorrow. I'd like to invite the band to come and see a Celtics basketball game. And he said, I don't think they've ever seen a basketball game. And I said, well, the piece de resistance is we have a leprechaun on the floor. Maybe they would like to see that. And he said, I'll get back to you. And he called me that morning. I think it was a Wednesday morning. And he said, yeah, the band would like to come and find out what a basketball game is. And I said, how do we do that? He said, have your security people talk to my security people. And about 6:30 that night, Bob and Mike, you might remember my old office on 150 Causeway Street was on the second floor, and it had a proper reception area, but it also had an escape door that went right into the lobby of the elevators. And so about 6:30, there's a knock on the door, and I open it, and it's Bono. And I said, Bono, what are you doing here? He said, I'm looking for Larry Moulter. And I said, you found him. Come on in. And I said, but where's the rest of the band? He said, they'll be here shortly. Well, we sat down and we started to talk. I said, how did you get here? And he was wearing his fringed rawhide jacket. And he said, I took a taxi. And I said, wait a minute, you took a taxi from the Four Seasons? He said, yeah. And I said, where'd you get off? He said, I got off in that train station. And I said, what? He said, I got off in that train station. Now it's rush hour. It's 6:15, 6:30 at night. And, they had just been on the cover of Time magazine. So they were fairly well known. And I said, but how did you get here to this building? He said, I just kept asking people where Larry Moulter's office was. 15 minutes later, the band arrived with their security up the ramp at 150. We went up to the skybox. They had a wonderful time. They were sitting on the floor of this skybox watching the game. And after the game, it was a playoff game. And I said, do you want to go down? Would you like to go down and stand on the parquet floor? Well, I brought them down, and they actually shot baskets on the parquet floor. And that won me an award in Boston Magazine for Best of Boston that summer for one of the best impresarios, because I got U2 to come and shoot baskets. Well, the long and short of it was, in September of that year, they came and they played the building for 2 nights, and they have played that building ever since.
Fantastic. Yeah, congratulations to you for, making that happen.
Well, I mean, we took a lot of work. I sat down with the members of the stagehands, the Teamsters, and I said, listen, whatever went on before, I can't fix. But going forward, we have to have some kind of honest accounting here of people that are working. Because if we do that, I will guarantee to you that we will bring more business back to the building. And, after a number of conversations, they were very accommodating, and we were able to fix the cost structure of some of these unions and then made the building more attractive. However, the sound was always an issue. But as music progressed, the sound engineering became more precise and more specific. But I remember standing in the back by the Zamboni entrance on the first night of U2 in September of that year with Don Law, and I could see the balcony shaking.
I agree with you. I was there. I was with Grateful Dead. The damn thing was shaking.
And I said, Don, what the hell is going on there? He said, that's a harmonic rhythm. And if you didn't have it, that balcony would collapse. So, U2 sort of made the building, or gave the other bands permission to come and play the building.
I'm telling you what, Larry, the Grateful Dead concert, that thing was just bouncing up and down. And it was It's like that Kansas City disaster.
Well, and thankfully, it's something called a harmonic rhythm, which I never knew.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, so we improved the advertising system. We did computerize the box office, and we eventually brought music. Last year, the TD Garden had 62 concerts, which was more than a Celtic game, number of games, or Bruins games. I remember when we were building or designing the building back in 90 and 91, the then manager of Aerosmith, who was a dear friend, said, "You ought to meet this guy, George Travis." George, at that time, and still is the tour manager for, among other artists, Bruce Springsteen. He's been with Bruce for 45 plus years. He does Ringo and all. He lives in Lincoln and in Mashpee. But, we had lunch over at the Bostonian Hotel. And he said to me something which caught my attention. He said, you guys build these buildings and forget that across time, the entertainment industry will become a major tenant. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, you build it for the sports teams. But when you look at what the steel grid above the stage looks like, when you look backstage and see what the turning radiuses are for these tractor trailers, and bands are traveling with 17, 18 tractor trailers, and they have to get into the building. He said, you never designed the building with that in mind. To which I said, could I hire you? And I hired him for about 15 months to help us design the ability to load in and load out very easily in a very narrow site. It was only 3 acres, so we didn't have a lot of space. But he helped, literally went to parking lots and laid out where the steel grids and the girders were going to be. And then he helped us design a system where the band could come in, connect their speakers and lights to, and then it would raise back up into the ceiling. So without George, it would have been a lot more difficult building to sell. But again, last year, 62 concerts.
When Bob was holding up and I have the same picture down in my basement of the old garden being gutted.
Yeah.
I always marveled at the distance between the new garden and the old garden. How much was it?
About 9 inches. 9 inches. And at that time, Storrow Drive was the back on the back wall of the garden, of the old garden. Right. And that was the 9-inch thing. And we only built on a 3-acre site. So that was a very difficult build. And one of the things, as you guys remember better than most people, the old garden had incredible sightlines. Okay? And the press box on the first balcony was only 11 rows back from the dashboard.
Yeah.
So you had incredible lines of sight if you were in that press box. Now in the new building, it's 29 rows back, but you get more of a vertical spread. So you're still fairly close.
Yeah, the sight lines are unbelievable.
Yeah, they were.
I mean, I can remember sitting up there with Johnny Most on that first level where he broadcast from, and you had the whole view of everything, except if you sat behind an unobstructed view seat. That of course.
Oh, we had obstructed view seats? That was new news to me.
I got a prop for that too, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the first proposal for a new Boston Garden was issued in 1966, and it took 30 years to finally get it approved and built.
You weren't, Larry, you weren't working there when the Stones concert happened in 72, right?
No, I was not. I arrived in March of 87. Okay. And stayed through July of 96. I felt that the first year of the new building, the Fleet Center at the time, it was important that I hang around because there were always going to be issues whenever you opened a new building. One of them, and again, I probably got a little greedy in October of 95 in terms of booking. We just opened the building on September 30th, and we had a desire to put as many events in there as we could. We get to the last week in October, and the circus has left. Now, the circus would put tons of dirt on the concrete floor, under which was the ice piping and everything. So we cleaned it up, but I had unknowingly booked, or not being familiar with how much work it would take in a new building to build ice. They cleaned it out on Sunday night and Monday morning. We had an event on Tuesday, a concert, And then the Celtics came in and played a game on Wednesday, and the Bruins came in on Thursday for their game. They had come back from their road trip, which normally happened during the circus. We didn't have enough time to build ice. Now, you got to remember, the old Garden, Mondo, who built the ice, there was no ventilation, there was no circulation, there was no air conditioning. So we opened a new building, and now we have several tons of refrigeration, we have ventilation, but we have people who had worked for 25 and 30 years making ice in a technically deficient building. And so they were learning how to make ice in the new building. Unfortunately, on that Thursday night, after the concert and the Celtics game, in the third period, the concrete began to come up through the ice in front of one of the nets. And the officials stopped the game for a while, and they had to figure out how to fix the 2-inch diameter circle that was exposing the concrete. And they did it, and the game was finished. And the next morning, I get a call from the NHL saying, what was the problem? I tried to explain it to them, and they said, well, we're going to send a guy on site for the next year to make sure that you know how to make ice. And so there was an NHL guy on site helping Mondo and his team learn how to make ice in a new building.
Lynch, you remember the old Garden when the fog would come in and they had to skate around and get rid of the fog?
Well, that was the same game, Larry, right? Where you had to skate around 88 or 90.
That was a Stanley Cup game. What I'm talking about was October of '95, when in the new building.
New building, okay.
Yeah, in the new building. And again, in a rush to push as many events in there as we could, I never considered the fact that taking several tons of dirt out and then making ice between a concert and a Celtic game was going to be that difficult. So, but we got through it.
Larry, go ahead.
I can remember you. I think the fog came first, and then the power outage came.
The lights went out. Yep.
The lights went out. And I remember you walking around. You had a walkie-talkie, and you were actually shepherding people towards the exit ramps that go down, down Causeway Street. And you were one man security, one man administration, one man police force, and you were just walking around telling everybody.
Welcome to the Delaware North family.
Well, let me give the background very quickly on that. You might remember, and that was May of that year. In early April, the old Forum in Montreal lost their power during a hockey game. And the morning I came in, and I said to my building manager, Bobby Burke, I said, Bobby, what would happen if we lost power here? He said, nothing good. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, why don't you come in tomorrow morning at about 6 o'clock? We'll go up to the top of the balcony, and I will have our electrician, Bobby, pull the plug, and you can see what the state of the building would like when it went dark. Next morning, 6 o'clock, we go up to the very top row, and through his walkie-talkie, he says, all right, pull the plug, Bobby. And the whole building went dark. Emergency lighting, only about a third of it worked. We walked our way down the entire, building, and we finally got down to the floor in which there was little, if any, light. And I said, what do we do going forward? And he said, you're not going to have enough time to fix this. And, you're going to have alternative generators, which we'll look at and explore. And he said, but I think maybe we should give all the ushers flashlights. And so all the ushers had flashlights that night during the Stanley Cup game when the power went out. And we were able to talk to them, and we evacuated the building in 17 minutes, which was a pretty spectacular result, given that the emergency lighting, nearly 2/3 of it wasn't functioning, and we had ushers with flashlights helping people down. So while I may have had a flashlight, there were a lot more flashlights there.
That was really a night to remember how well everybody behaved.
Yes.
And how everybody you got everybody out of there in record time. And the stupid thing with the NHL rules was that there was Game 4 against Edmonton, and Edmonton was going to sweep the Bruins.
Right.
But they had to say, well, we'll make this game up if necessary. We had to fly all the way to Edmonton, play one game, and then just come home, and of course,
So I'm standing, after we evacuated the building, I'm standing by the old guard shack, which you remember in 150 Causeway Street, and John Ziegler, the then commissioner, is in my face. he was not a happy puppy, nor should he have been. And you remember, the buses for the teams were parked generally in front of 150 Causeway Street.
Right.
So the teams would come out of their locker room, go to the elevator lobby, which I had talked about earlier, on the second floor, and go down and get in their car. Wayne Gretzky walks by me and somebody whispers to him, and he goes, "You're that effing guy." And I said, "Yeah, I'm the guy."
Well, there's something to tell your kids.
Oh yeah.
Larry came up with one of the great quotes in Boston business, sports, whatever. That Boston, if you want to define Boston, it can be defined in 3 words: politics, sports, and revenge.
Yep, that's
Politics, sports, and revenge is Larry Moulter's quote, and that has lived on and been embellished.
It's in the American Heritage Book of Quotations, which somebody sent me.
Why can't we get players like that in that same book?
Yeah, there you go. It's something like that. And it was on the quote actually originated on the front page of the New York Times. And it was during a very frustrating period. Again, the first proposal was 1966. And now it's 1990, 91, 92. We're dragging ourselves around. Jerry Jacobs is trying to find a way to get this building built, because you remember, aside from a Stanley Cup game being canceled, a Celtics game in November of 1990 against the Atlanta Hawks was canceled because of condensation on the floor.
Right. Yeah,
okay?
Right.
And it was a very humid day. I had flown back from New York for some business in New York. I called my wife and said, "I don't think I'm going to come right home. I'm going to go to the Garden," because we all knew of the fog and what happened at hockey games. But this was a particularly humid and moist night. And fortunately, I was there. And in the second quarter, I had to cancel the game. And again, standing in the production office, I had a very irate Red Auerbach yelling at me what happened and how this was. So we had that event. We had the Stanley Cup event, and then unfortunately we had the tragic explosion where 2 electric workers died in December of 1990 as they were doing late on a Friday night, early Saturday morning, they were doing a repair to one of the electric rooms. And I remember getting a call at 3:30 in the morning and then having to go to the Garden and being escorted to one of these electric vaults by the state police. And unfortunately, 2 independent contractors had passed as a result of that explosion. But I think those things all created a sense of we need to do something about this. And whether it was Ray Flynn, Governor Weld, eventually the political powers sort of sense that this needed to happen, and we can't let what happened be reflective of what Boston was as a city.
Yeah, that's understandable. Well, I'm going to get back to the quote: politics, sports, and revenge.
We all amend it today to politics, sports, revenge, and money, private equity money.
That's fair enough. And come into the revenge part. I mean, that seems to be the most interesting one. We all know about politics and sports, but where did the revenge part come in?
Well, I think there was a lot of, how do I say it nicely, friction between the then Senate president and the people who owned the Garden. There was a lot of impediments that were thrown up. There were a lot of challenges that came out of the Senate side. And I can remember sitting in Governor Weld's office on, I think it was January 4th of 93, as the session was winding down. Remember, when the session shut down, no further legislation could go. So we had a bill. The bill started in September of 93 when I had met with the Secretary of Economic Development for the governor, Steve Taco. And we had, and I won't get too complicated, but by an eminent domain taking that the state and Fred Salbucci did in March of 88, I believe it was, they took the flat, remember the parking lot behind the old Garden? It was a flat piece of land where cars, and you walked across it from the trains that stopped at the beginning of their parking lot. Well, by eminent domain, the state took it and gave the city ear rights 42 feet above the ground. So while we had been engineering to build a building on the ground, we now had to understand how to fly a building 42 feet up in the air. And with that came a whole number of easements that had to be granted. So in September of 93, I was told it would be a 3-page bill and there won't be any problem. By the time I'm sitting in Weld's office as the session is closing, it's a 36-page bill. And we had just spent the afternoon with Senate and House counsel trying to go through the particulars of it. And from about 10:30 on, there was what I'll characterize as shuttle diplomacy going on between me, Weld, and the Senate president. I would be sitting in Weld's office and he said, I'd have to go talk to the Senate president. And he would come back and say, can you do this? And I said, yes, I could do this, but can we get this passed? Yes, it'll all get passed. And I remember at about 11:45 that night, he had come back and said, one more thing the Senate president needs. I said, what is that? He said, they need to reduce the height of the building by several stories. I said, okay, are we going to have a bill if that's done? And he said, yeah. I said, we can do that. He said, do you have the authority to do it? I said, I do, as long as you're telling me I can rely on you to have the bill passed. He said, I can assure you the bill will pass. He then leaves the room and 12 o'clock comes, 12:05, 12:10, a little bit before 12:15, he comes in and says, I'm sorry, but they wouldn't put the bill up for a vote. So the revenge.
Are you talking about Bill Bolger when you talk about?
I'm talking about Senate President Bill Bolger.
Okay, I'm just saying no, it's right.
And so the revenge part came, or we, during the 3 weeks after that, there was a lot of, as you recall, because you reported on it, there was a lot of angst about would the Bruins be moving to New Hampshire, what's going to happen, and there was a long hearing at Gardner Auditorium. 3rd or 4th week in January, and we weren't making much progress. And then back to Jack Connors, you might remember there was this rather fortuitous and important meeting at Father Monin, the president of BC's house, one Thursday afternoon in early February. And Jerry Jacobs, Richard Gordon, the owner of the Hartford Whalers, who was a dear friend of Mr. Jacobs, myself, a couple of our attorneys, Jack, Father Monin, and Bolger and Tom Finneran, we were able to hash out finally, to the good graces of Jack and Father Monin, an agreement. And then we went back, we left Father Monin's house probably about 10 o'clock, and by 6 a.m. we had an agreement, which then held a press conference where, there's a picture of me and Bolger announcing this deal and me looking up at the heavens, and Will McDonough captured it as something like, Molter had to pray to the heavens to get this deal done. So without getting any more gruesome, there was a lot of revenge back and forth here.
Well, maybe you should add religion to politics, sports, revenge, and religion.
Yeah, maybe. But money trumps religion sometimes.
Sometimes money runs religion. Let me just speaking of money runs the show, and not a lot of it. I can only say that. This is the part, and Mike's going to ask you a very important question, Larry.
Okay.
After I do this, I don't know if you're into camping at all. Pam, do you guys go camping or?
My idea of camping is a Holiday Inn.
Okay, I got that. I understand. Well, this is somehow you got to get to where you are to the Holiday Inn, and maybe sometimes you want to take let's assume you're a camper, and I'll just say, are you ready to see what's new in 2026?
Yeah.
That's right. Cold Springs RV has next year's models, and they're arriving daily. It's all about politics, sports, revenge, and camping. So go check out the latest in pop-ups, travel trailers, fifth wheelers, and motorhomes. And don't ask me to describe them because I have no idea.
Well, I can say that my daughter, when she was at BC, rented, I believe, a Cold Springs RV with her roommates to travel to Notre Dame.
Oh my God.
Notre Dame game. And they brought it back almost intact. There was a lot of mud inside there, but they brought it back.
Campers, that's what mud's all. That's great. That's a great story. Next year she'll be going to North Carolina. Belichick night. Okay, wait a minute. Let me finish this. Cold Springs RV, the doors are always open. Well, the great thing, Larry, that she not only rented a camper, she rented it from Cold Springs RV.
I believe she did. I remember paying for it.
That's right. Well, this is different. Mike's got an offer for you that you won't have to pay for. If you want to see the latest in camping, get to Cold Springs RV, your destination for all things camping, or learn more online where you can learn about everything. ColdSpringsRV.com. Mike, this is our traditional Cold Springs question.
All right, Larry, here you go. You remember John Madden was afraid to fly, so they had a Madden cruiser.
Correct.
Well, we're trying to get Cold Springs RV to make a Lobel Lynchy cruiser. That's going to be just absolutely spectacular. I mean, and all our guests on this show are going to get to use it for 1 week.
Wow.
The only stipulation is that you have to bring somebody to ride shotgun with you.
Okay.
It can be a political figure. It can be someone deceased, someone from in history. It can be an athlete, a musician. It can be a politician. And so we're going to let you have it for 7 days, drive cross country. We'll fly you back first class. And so who would ride shotgun with Larry Moulter? Who would you like to have a conversation with and ride cross country with for 7 days?
Wow, that's a hard one. I mean, I'd put Marty Walsh in there because, we'd become very good friends. And first time I met him during the election in 2013, he said to me, "I have you to thank for my sobriety." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "On April 25th, 1995, you kicked me out of the Boston Garden from a Bruins game." And I said, "I didn't kick you out." He said, "No, your security guys did." And I said, "Well, why did we do that?" He said, "Because I was really, really drunk." And I said, "What happened?" He said, and he's told this story publicly, so I'm not, saying anything confidentially. In fact, he told it in front of the Jacobs at one point, and they pulled me aside and said, "This is a true story?" I said, "Absolutely true." He said, "I went across the street to the Harp, had no idea how I got home, and 3 days later I went into AA." And that story I verified. There were two people with him, his brother and a friend of his. And separately, in the course of that conversation in the fall of 2013, both of them said separately, "Yes, this is a true story. He was thrown out." To which I said, "Well, why didn't we throw you guys out?" And his brother said, "Because we weren't as obnoxious as my brother." So I would drive across with Marty Walsh, and we could talk hockey, we could talk politics, and probably a little bit of revenge as well.
That's great.
That's a great idea. I love it. I love it.
Me too.
So you start this project with the new garden. So
yes.
Tell some of the hurdles that have not been presented to the general public. I know you always had this great thing. We all wore hard hats, and you had updates for us. Gave us, okay, we've now completed this section of the building, this section. Yeah. Some of the impediments you have to deal with.
Well, the legislative impediment that I dealt with, I mentioned a moment ago, that was significant. Without the agreement of the legislature, and I have to say that the governor and Ray Flynn were very, very supportive and put their shoulders into getting this thing done. Again, because I think we all realized that after 60 plus years, the Boston Garden was beginning to fail. And the world was turning, and we needed a new facility in Boston. Construction is never easy. I think steel was a problem at the time. Some of the securing of subcontractors was difficult. And again, we were building at 42 feet above the ground. And I don't know that people fully appreciate it, but the reason the state took that flat parking area is Fred Salvucci, the then Secretary of Transportation, or former Secretary of Transportation, wanted to move the trains from the back of that parking lot into and under the garden. So they needed to take the land. Now, the problem with putting it 42 feet above the ground was that the trains, with their stacks and smoke coming out, would be coming in directly under the floor of the new garden. And with that heat, how do you ensure that the ice was never going to melt? Because the heat from those trains, from those 10 tracks, were going to be so severe. And as the heat rose and hit the ceiling, it then would go up through the ceiling and impact the floor. So that had to be an engineering problem that got taken care of, but it was not an easy problem. They had to figure out how to vent the smoke from the trains on these 10 tracks so it didn't impair the integrity of the ice. I think that was one of the bigger things that happened.
Freddie Salvucci, one of the great quotes by Mike Barnacle. If Freddie Salvucci wants to depress the central artery, all he has to do is stand there and talk to it.
Well, I was the lobbyist for Bechtel Construction Firm back in the early 80s. One of their two lobbyists or three lobbyists, as they were trying to get designated to be the project manager for the Big Dig. And I do remember the first day, later that first day when I was appointed, I'm sitting in the office of 150 Causeway Street, and the project manager for Bechtel, Mel Mursky, calls me and says, "Congratulations." I said, "Well, great, thank you very much." He said, "Too bad you won't be in that building for long." I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" He said, "Well, that's one of the 4 buildings we were going to take by eminent domain, because they needed 150 to come down to create the tunnel that came out eventually."
Right.
I said, "Oh, I had no idea." So in 1988, the federal government took that property, which was owned privately by some other fellow, and they gave him what they called a pro tanto award for $48 million. In 1992, he won $72 million award in court. So, Jerry O'Neill became significantly wealthier by virtue of that building being taken. Now, the problem it created for us was that if you couldn't build a new arena, and we weren't sure in 1990 and 91 that we were going to be able to do that, you couldn't take 150 Causeway Street down because it would impact the operations of the Garden. Remember, 150 was where the elephants, the parquet, and everybody, all the equipment for concerts came across those 2 bridges. So, if we had to close 150, so eventually there was a gap of about $16 million to get to our $160 million budget number. And we were able, through the good offices of the Federal Highway Division and our attorneys, the lease that the Garden had with the old Garden that started in 1928 had a significant value here in 1993. And so that value, instead of the state taking it, if you will, by eminent domain, our lease, they paid $16 million to close the gap, because the leasehold went back 60 plus years. And without that leasehold, you couldn't keep the Garden open.
That's interesting. You think the Celtics are going to have, with the new ownership and the way that it's structured and the millions of dollars that it costs to run a franchise, that they might have to build a new building, that they got to get out of that lease?
I mean, we built a building for $160 million. We built it on time and on schedule, plus another $30 million for linkage payments and easement payments to the state and the MBTA. If you look at the building that was proposed in Philadelphia, an arena, it was going to be $1.3 billion. And think of it, 30 years later, we go from 160 million to 1.3 billion to build an arena. So I think those kind of numbers are staggering, but you also see the kind of success that if you put money into a facility like Gillette Stadium, you can build out, Patriot Place. And any of these new arena projects have to take into account, because one, the cost of an arena was going to be significantly higher than it was 30 years ago, has to also figure out, how do you generate revenue out of the companion development that might be around a building? So a new building, and I'm not going to speak for the owners, and I'm not going to speak for anybody on building a new building, but the economics and financial aspects of it almost demand that it's on a big plot of land where you then can do additional development and you can create additional revenue. Standalone arenas, and that's what we did in North Station. I mean, look, we have 3 towers there. Those were permitted in 1993. The first tower in back was not behind the Tip O'Neill building, was an apartment building, was probably built 15 years after we got all the permits. And then the 2 towers on Causeway Street with Hub Hall, and what you get with Hub Hall and banners and all the activity, economic activity there, that 1.3 million of square feet was, even in 1993, viewed as integral to the success of a building. So now if you go to Causeway Street and North Station, you have economic dynamics that were critical to ensuring that a building can be built. Now that if you're talking 1.3 billion, you better have a big development site alongside.
Can this town support another arena concert-wise? I mean, are we a big enough city to have?
The concert industry is always a unique one. The only people that win in the concert industry are the acts, because if you have multiple buildings bidding on a particular act and multiple promoters, so if you have Kraft at a soccer stadium and the Red Sox and Don Law at Fenway, and you have the Garden, you may have 3 different promoters who are offering the bands more and more money to play their venue. And the venues don't really make money off of the concert per se, because the promoter may pay some modest rent, but if there's a lot of 3-card Monte that goes on when you settle a concert account. But where the venues make their money is from parking and concessions and food and beverage. So I think, create a soccer stadium and then a new arena, and you have the old arena. I mean, I think it's just a competitive marketplace that doesn't bode well for any of the landlords, but it does bode well for the acts.
Well, let me ask you some football questions, because I wanted to ask you, and I do this around, there must have been a lot of pressure on you to get tickets, for little favors. I mean, a guy in your position of power with that building and knowing that these games and concerts are always so high. So what are some of the more outrageous requests that you had? That
one of my sons actually got me a T-shirt called "Tickets Are Us," because governors would call, bank chairman would call, particularly the Grateful Dead. To come back to that for a moment, there was a major fan of the Grateful Dead sitting in the governor's office at that time, Governor Weld, and every time they came in, he would call me and ask if it would be possible to buy, and he always paid for it. Would buy a skybox so he could watch, bring his family and watch the Grateful Dead. So those things happened. I mean, I had bank chairmen calling on behalf of their kids. Concerts, the Bruins and Celtics handled their own tickets. So I got, not a great many calls. The Garden had access to some tickets, particularly in the press rows in the old Garden. But most of the demand for Bruins and Celtics went through Bruins and Celtics, offices. The concert was where it really got a little bit dicey, and people would come to me. So U2 on St. Patrick's Day in 1992, we had 16,000 people in the building and 10,000 people outside. And I got a lot of calls from people who needed to be inside. And that's going to be hard. But St. Patrick's Day with U2 in Boston, you had to be there.
No question about it. Let me throw out a couple names to you, and then we can go right down there. And Lynch, you jump in, of course, in this. Bob Kraft. I mean, this is about the ownership in this town. Kraft and Belichick, I'm just reading a lot of these things after the Belichick game Saturday. We're on to UNC Charlotte. This is one of these great fan comments. We're on to UNC Charlotte. We're on to Richmond, the next 2 games for Belichick. But beyond that, Kraft, the Belichick, your ownership in general, and let's start with him.
Yeah, I mean, ownership in Boston amongst those 4 and 5 teams have really changed dramatically. We saw it with the Red Sox. We see it with Jerry Jacobs. I mean, the building that opened in 95, there's been nearly $270 million of improvements put in that building since it opened. And when it opened, and this was a privately financed building by Jerry Jacobs, $160 million that he financed, it allowed us to have a...
Yeah, but you talked him into that.
Pardon?
You talked him into that.
Oh, I think a number of people talked him into it, but it was a good deal for him to have there. I think people like Bill Hassett, who knew development and knew real estate, knew that this was a deal.
Yeah, but I don't think he was going down that road, was he, Larry?
Well, he looked again. He almost sold it in 84, 85 just to retain the concessions. And Bill Hassett said, this is a real estate deal. Right. So, I mean, we had in January of 96, we had an NHL All-Star game. That would not have happened without that building. 4 months after it opened, we had an NHL All-Star game. We then had NCAA games. We had a Democratic National Convention. We had bands that would never play the building show up and play the building because they liked the new facility. And we had a lot of other events that sort of developed. And, if you walk inside an arena today, walk inside a TD Garden, you'll see the $270 million that was put in over the past 20 years to upgrade it. I mean, the technology. When you look at these buildings, they're not just places where events happen. They're food courts, they're retail shops, they're television studios, they're advertising kiosks. And so those buildings have to be designed, and that was part of our design challenge in 90 through 93. But these buildings, they have a unique personality now that has changed over 30 years. And so owners have had to adapt. It's Delaware North or Robert Kraft or John Henry, they've all had to adapt to the changing demographics. People want to sit in their seat and use their smartphone. And you can't do that without upgrading the technology of the buildings, regardless of which building you own.
I was going to go back.
When you were, starting to clean out the old garden, what are some of the strangest things that you found?
Never found the monkey carcass, which people always claimed was a monkey carcass from the circus. There were just odd bits and pieces that were left behind by different, promoters or acts. I don't think any one thing stuck out in my mind. I mean, I was happy to walk away with the 2 seats in section 104 that my wife and I had our first date on. I was happy to walk away the final Celtics game in May of 95, which they lost the playoff game. And I had represented Red Auerbach on his first autobiography. So I knew Red pretty well. And we're walking out, and I said, Red, I'm sorry about, having lost this game. It was the last game here in the Garden. And I go, the grumpy guy that he was. And I said, would you sign my ticket? So I have a Red Auerbach autograph final Celtic ticket from the old Garden. So for me, there was a lot of little stuff like that, a piece of the parquet. We did sell $1.3 million worth of merchandise when we opened the new building and closed the old one. We had a fellow who ran the pro shop, Frank Giametti, who was Bart Giametti, the baseball commissioner, one of his nephews. And he decided we're going to create, and you probably have it. But he said, when we melt the ice in the old Garden after the final game of Tuesday, that final week in the old Garden, we're going to bottle the ice, and I'm going to cut the net up, and we're going to put it in a nice little wooden box. And the box sold for like $50 or $60. And it had a little bottle of water from the ice that was melted. Now, I trust Frank that it was the ice that was melted, and a piece of the nets from the old Garden in this monogram little box.
If it came down to politics, sports, and revenge, which is the most important?
Sports. I think we all look to sports as a way to sort of take away some of the angst we feel every day, some of the problems we have in our own lives, some of the dysfunction we see around us. It's good to escape for whatever that moment is and watch a sports team perform at a highest level. Because at the end of the day, we're a community. And there's a quote from Bart Giametti, which I have in his book that I've often showed people. These buildings are where communities gather. It's not a place where seats are. It's where people come and celebrate something as a community. And I think that's what sports and concerts allow us to do in the right building. You have to think of this, again, not as a food court, not as a retail spot, but as a building that brings people together. And that's hopefully what the TD Garden and Fleet Center have done over the past 30 years.
Yeah, I hadn't been down there in a couple of years, and I was down there about a month ago, and I was just blown away.
Yeah.
I mean, and you're right. There may be 18,000 people inside, but there's going to be another 5,000 to 10,000 people outside, just congregating, watching on the big screen, going to banners. It's a destination right now.
Yeah, and look what they do to Canal Street during the playoff season. They close it, and look at the people there. And the entrance to the Garden now is a much more magnificent entrance than the old building was. So, we're fortunate that Jerry Jacobs stepped up. despite the fact that the legislation never passed in the January of '93, we were able to face that challenge. And we had good friends like Jack Connors and Father Monin who got us there. And Ray Flynn was enormous, as was Weld. But we got to the finish line. We built it. And I think the past 30 years speak volumes about how important that building was to what Boston became.
Let me get a quick spot in here, Larry, before we let you go. Hey, if you're thinking about a new vehicle, go with Lobel and Lynch. Go see our good friend George Gray at George Gray's Lexington Toyota. Lobel and I have been customers for years. Our family's been customers, and we know that George Gray will treat you right. They're family-owned and operated dealership that we trust, and we know that you can trust as well. Go see the big wheel, the great George Gray at George Gray's Lexington Toyota, 409 Mass Ave in Lexington. He's been a big fan of all Boston teams for many, many years, and I know he's a big fan of the new garden as well, and everything you did to make that happen, Larry. It was spectacular. Working with you. I know I can probably speak for Bob too. You were great to us in the media. When things sometimes the doors weren't always open to the media, but you opened it to us, and we thank you for it.
Well, again, this was a building that the people owned. And I remember telling Jerry Jacobs that the first time I met him, the day before my press conference in March of '87. I said, I hope I can make you proud owning this building, because it is a public trust. And any of these buildings, despite the fact that you have billionaires behind them, communities walk in, diverse communities walk in, and they have to celebrate what's going on. So I think the building has done that. I think it's done its job well, and I think it will grow and continue, and the stewardship of the Jacobs family will continue to improve. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, Wick Grossbeck earlier this spring said this garden, because of the money that was put in over the past 20 years to upgrade it, is one of the top 3 buildings in the nation.
Yep.
It's hard to argue with that. And I would only say one thing about getting back to the sports politics and revenge thing, that sports being the most important, because this is such a community of neighborhoods, and sports seems to blend that line, that all neighborhoods, no matter their differences, and there are great differences in Boston. It's like Pittsburgh, a city of neighborhoods, and why Larry Archino was so successful here in Boston, that he understood that, and that sports manages to bring those people together.
Well, the other quote of mine that seems to get some notoriety is that Boston is a very tribal city.
There you go. Right. There's my point exactly.
And you have to work to make sure the tribes can coexist correctly. It's not easy, whether it's in a building or out in the streets or in government, but we have to remember that at the end of the day, we share some community sense of purpose, and that's why we live here.
Amen.
Well said, Larry. And we'll end on that note right there. Larry, thanks so much. Appreciate the time.
You're great.
For us. And I hope you get to sit in your seats on January 7th. That's the date?
I think, don't tell my wife, but I think it'll work out.
Okay.
I think it's going to work out. I have a few friends still in the Celtics office.
We'll go rent a camper and take her on a trip. That's a good thing. All right, thanks, Larry.
Thank you for thinking of me. I used to be somebody, and my kids now no longer call me for tickets. I call them for tickets. So thank you.
All right. The great Larry Moulter, everyone. Hope you enjoy the show. Make sure you follow us on unanchoredboston.com, and make sure you follow us on YouTube as well. See you next time.
Thank you.